Sometimes, the smallest sentence becomes the biggest clue. On the morning of July 18, 2014, respected Florida State University law professor Dan Markel was driving home after leaving the gym. It was an ordinary Friday. The sun was shining. His two young sons had already been dropped off at daycare. He was talking to a friend on the phone as he pulled into the driveway of his Tallahassee home. Then, his voice changed. "There's someone in my driveway, and I don't recognize them." Seconds later, the call went silent. Across the street, a neighbor heard what sounded like a loud bang. When he looked outside, he saw a metallic green Toyota Prius speeding away from Dan's house. At first, he assumed it was nothing more than a burglary, but when he walked over to check, he found Dan slumped inside his running car. The driver's side window had been shattered. Dan was still breathing, barely. The neighbor immediately called 911, describing the horrifying scene as emergency responders rushed toward the house. Doctors fought to save Dan's life. They couldn't. 14 hours later, he was dead. At first glance, it looked like a random shooting, a robbery gone wrong, perhaps road rage, anything but a carefully planned assassination. But detectives would soon uncover something almost impossible to believe. This wasn't the work of one angry gunman. It wasn't even the work of two people. It was the beginning of an investigation that would expose a murder-for-hire conspiracy stretching across hundreds of miles, involving hitmen, secret payments, coded conversations, and members of one of South Florida's most prominent families. More than a decade later, the case still stands as one of the most shocking murder conspiracies in modern American history. Because the reason Dan Markel was killed wasn't money, it wasn't revenge. According to prosecutors, it was custody. A father who refused to give up his children. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country or city in the comments below. It's always amazing to see this community come together from every corner of the world. Now, to understand why someone would allegedly spend years plotting Dan Markel's murder, we first have to understand who he was. A man which had everything to lie for Daniel Eric Markel was born on October 9, 1972 in Toronto, Canada. Raised in a close-knit Jewish family by his parents, Ruth and Phil, alongside his sister Shelley, Dan developed a reputation early in life for being energetic, intensely curious, and exceptionally bright. While many children were still trying to decide what they wanted to become, Dan already seemed to know. He loved ideas, he loved debate, and above all, he loved the law. His ambition carried him across the world, first to Harvard University, then to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he completed a fellowship. Later to Cambridge University, where he earned a master's degree in political theory. Finally, he returned to Harvard Law School, graduating magna cum laude in 2001 before clerking for a federal appellate judge and practicing white-collar criminal defense in Washington, D.C. It was the kind of resume most lawyers spend a lifetime trying to build. Dan accomplished it before turning 33. A rising star in 2005, Dan accepted a position at Florida State University's College of Law. For him, it wasn't simply another job. It was exactly where he wanted to be. Students admired him. Colleagues respected him. He published extensively, became a nationally recognized legal scholar, and co-founded Prof's Blog, one of the country's most influential blogs for law professors and legal scholars. Fellow academics described him as remarkably productive and intellectually generous. Everything appeared to be falling into place. Then, he met someone. Wendy, while teaching at Florida State, Dan joined a Jewish dating website called JDate. That's where he met Wendy Adelson. She was intelligent, accomplished, a law student with an international relations master's degree from Cambridge. She also came from a wealthy South Florida family whose parents operated a successful dental practice. The relationship developed quickly. On February 26, 2006, they married in a lavish ceremony in Boca Raton that even received an announcement in the New York Times. Soon afterward, Wendy moved to Tallahassee. The couple appeared to have built the kind of life many people dream about. Successful careers, a beautiful home, two sons, Benjamin, born in 2009, and Lincoln, born the following year. From the outside, they looked like the perfect family, but appearances can be remarkably deceptive. A marriage unraveling, not everyone adjusted to Tallahassee. According to the source material, Wendy never truly felt at home there. She found the city too small and too far from the close-knit family she had left behind in South Florida. Then, in September 2012, everything changed. While Dan was away on a business trip, Wendy packed the house. She took the furniture, the children, the contents of their safety deposit box, and left. When Dan returned home, he found an empty house. Divorce papers had been left on the bed. He later described the experience to friends as his own Pearl Harbor. For weeks, he didn't know where his sons were until he learned Wendy had taken them to her parents' home in Coral Springs and filed for divorce. It was the beginning of a bitter custody battle, one that would consume the next 2 years of Dan's life. He fought through the courts to preserve his legal rights as a father. Those rights meant Wendy could not simply relocate the children hundreds of miles away. She remained tied to Tallahassee because of the custody arrangement. Looking back, investigators would later believe that custody dispute became the foundation for everything that followed. But no one knew that yet. To Dan, he was simply fighting for the chance to remain close to his sons. He had no idea that somewhere beyond Tallahassee, people were allegedly beginning to discuss a solution that would permanently end the dispute, a solution from which there would be no appeal. Every murder investigation begins with a question: who stood to gain? For Dan Markel, investigators eventually came to one conclusion. The motive wasn't money, it wasn't business, it wasn't revenge. According to prosecutors, it was something far more personal. 2 little boys, a divorce that never really ended. When Dan and Wendy divorced in 2012, the marriage ended, but the conflict didn't. Every custody hearing, every legal filing, every disagreement over parenting kept the former couple tied together. Wendy wanted to return permanently to South Florida, where her parents and extended family lived. Dan refused. Under Florida law, as a father with shared custody, he had legal rights that prevented their 2 sons from being relocated hundreds of miles away without court approval. Those rights effectively kept Wendy in Tallahassee, a city she had grown to dislike. To Dan, he was simply protecting his relationship with Benjamin and Lincoln. To prosecutors, that legal obstacle would later become the center of the alleged conspiracy: the Adelson family. To understand what investigators eventually uncovered, you have to understand the Adelson family. They were well known in South Florida, successful, financially comfortable, close-knit. Wendy's parents, Donna and Harvey Adelson, operated a prosperous dental practice. Her older brother, Charlie Adelson, was a periodontist who worked in the family business. By nearly every public measure, they appeared to be an accomplished family. But behind closed doors, prosecutors alleged frustration had been building for years. According to the source material, Dan's refusal to agree to relocation meant Wendy and her children remained in Tallahassee instead of moving closer to Coral Springs. The family even attempted to offer Dan money in exchange for greater custody flexibility, but he refused. The legal battle continued, and while Dan focused on raising his sons, his own life slowly began moving forward. A new chapter. Friends noticed something different about Dan. After the emotional toll of the divorce, he was smiling again. He had started seeing someone new. Constant stress that had consumed so much of his life was finally beginning to lift. One friend later remembered telling him, "You're having fun again. You need to celebrate that and leave all this negativity behind." Dan believed the worst was behind him. He couldn't have known someone else was allegedly making very different plans. An unexpected name within hours of the shooting. Police interviewed Wendy. Like anyone whose former spouse had just been attacked, she appeared shocked and emotional. Then, she mentioned something detectives would never forget. She told investigators that her brother, Charlie, had often joked about hiring a hitman because Dan had treated her badly. According to Wendy, Charlie once joked that it had been cheaper to buy her a television than to hire someone to kill Dan. At the time, detectives didn't know what to make of it. Was it simply a tasteless family joke? Or had Wendy unknowingly pointed investigators towards something much bigger? It was an extraordinary statement, one detectives couldn't ignore. Charlie Adelson. As investigators dug deeper, Charlie Adelson became increasingly interesting, not because they had evidence tying him directly to the shooting, at least not yet, but because of who he knew. By late 2013, according to prosecutors, Charlie had begun communicating with a woman named Catherine Magbanua. The relationship was on and off, but Catherine also had a connection to another man, Garcia. Garcia had gang associations in South Florida, and unlike Charlie, he allegedly knew people capable of carrying out violent crimes. At this point, investigators still had no murder weapon, no confession, no eyewitness identifying the shooter. What they did have was the beginning of a network, one that stretched from Tallahassee all the way to South Florida. A murder-for-hire theory. As prosecutors pieced together the evidence, they developed a theory that stunned even veteran investigators. This wasn't a crime committed in the heat of the moment. According to the prosecution, it was a carefully planned murder-for-hire conspiracy that began months before Dan was killed. Their alleged motive was remarkably simple. Remove Dan, and the custody problem disappears. Benjamin and Lincoln could then be raised hundreds of miles away from Tallahassee. As one prosecutor later suggested through the evidence presented at trial, Dan's legal right to remain an active father had become the obstacle the conspirators allegedly wanted to eliminate. If true, it meant Dan wasn't killed because of who he was. He was killed because he refused to stop being a father. The Plan B's investigators alleged that Catherine Magbanua became the intermediary. She connected Charlie Adelson to Sigfredo Garcia. Garcia, in turn, recruited his longtime associate, Luis Rivera. The conspiracy now allegedly involved multiple people, each separated by another layer. Money would not flow directly from the alleged organizers to the gunman. Instead, it would pass through intermediaries. Investigators later uncovered dozens of payments from the Adelson family dental practice to Catherine Magbanua. According to payroll records, there was no documented job description or regular work schedule that explained those payments, making them a key focus of the investigation. For detectives, the financial trail was beginning to emerge, but they still needed proof. The first trip, early June 2014. A rented Toyota Prius left South Florida. Inside, Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera. According to investigators, they drove nearly 500 miles to Tallahassee. They checked into motels, drove through neighborhoods, studied Dan Markel's daily routine. Then, without carrying out the attack, they returned to South Florida. It appeared to have been nothing more than a reconnaissance mission. A rehearsal. 6 weeks later, they came back. This time, they weren't just watching, they were allegedly ready to finish the job. Before we continue, if you're enjoying these long-form true crime documentaries and appreciate the hours of research behind them, consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue producing evidence-based investigations like this one. On the morning of July 18, 2014, Dan Markel followed his normal routine. He dropped his sons at daycare, worked out at the gym, then headed home. What he didn't know was that investigators say the green Toyota Prius had already begun following him through Tallahassee. Every turn, every traffic light, every mile, someone was watching. And within minutes, Dan Markel's life would come to a sudden and violent end. The investigation that exposed the conspiracy, the perfect murder, doesn't exist. Not because killers always make mistakes, but because every decision leaves a trail. For investigators in Tallahassee, Dan Markel's murder looked almost impossible to solve. There was no obvious suspect, no murder weapon, no eyewitness who could identify the shooter, just a respected law professor, shot in his own driveway. But detectives believed one thing. This wasn't random. Someone had planned it. Now they had to prove it. The getaway car. The first major break came from surveillance footage. Investigators gathered video from homes, businesses, traffic cameras, and nearby intersections. Again and again, one vehicle appeared, a metallic green Toyota Prius. Witnesses had seen it leaving Dan's neighborhood moments after the shooting. Security cameras captured it moving through Tallahassee before and after the murder. The same car appeared at gas stations, intersections, and hotels. Detectives traced it back to a rental agency. The Prius had been rented in South Florida. That single discovery transformed the investigation. The killers hadn't come from Tallahassee. They had traveled hundreds of miles to get there. Following the trail, once detectives identified the rental car, they began reconstructing its journey. They obtained SunPass toll records, hotel receipts, fuel purchases, cell phone records, surveillance video. Each piece confirmed another part of the timeline. The Prius had left South Florida. driven north to Tallahassee, remained in the city during the hours surrounding the murder, then immediately returned south. It wasn't coincidence. It looked like a mission. Two men from Miami investigators eventually identified the two men connected to the rental car, Sigfredo Garcia and his longtime associate, Luis Rivera. Both had traveled together during the murder, but detectives still faced a major problem. Being in Tallahassee didn't prove either man had pulled the trigger. They needed someone to talk, and eventually, someone did. The first crack, Luis Rivera made a decision that would change the investigation forever. Facing serious criminal charges in an unrelated case, he agreed to cooperate. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Rivera began telling investigators exactly what had happened. According to his testimony, he and Garcia had driven to Tallahassee twice. The first trip was to study Dan's routine. The second was to kill him. Rivera admitted he drove the Prius. Garcia got out with the gun. Moments later, Rivera heard the shots. Then Garcia jumped back inside, and they fled the neighborhood. For the first time, investigators had an insider describing the murder itself. Follow the Money. Rivera's testimony answered one question: who carried out the shooting? But another question remained: who paid for it? Detectives returned to the financial records. They focused on Catherine Magbanua. According to prosecutors, large sums of money flowed to her after Dan's murder. She had close relationships with both Charlie Adelson and Sigfredo Garcia. Investigators believed she was the bridge connecting the alleged organizers to the gunmen. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed proof, something direct, something impossible to explain away. The undercover sting. Then the FBI tried something unusual. Agents created a fake extortion plot. An undercover officer approached Charlie Adelson with a story. The supposed extortionists claimed they knew who had murdered Dan Markel, and unless they were paid, they would expose everyone involved. Investigators weren't really after the money. They wanted Charlie's reaction. Would an innocent person laugh it off, call the police, or panic? According to prosecutors, Charlie did something else. He began discussing the situation in coded language with family members. Those recorded conversations would later become some of the most important evidence presented in court. The TV. One phrase kept appearing: the TV. To anyone listening casually, it sounded completely ordinary, but prosecutors argued it wasn't about a television at all. They alleged it referred back to Charlie's earlier joke that buying Wendy a television had been cheaper than hiring a hitman. Now, years after Dan's murder, that same word resurfaced during secretly recorded conversations. The prosecution argued the coded references revealed consciousness of guilt. The defense strongly disagreed. They insisted investigators were forcing innocent conversations to fit their theory. The jury would eventually decide which interpretation made more sense. The arrests began piece by piece. The conspiracy began to unravel. First came Sigfredo Garcia, then Luis Rivera, later Catherine Magbanua. Each arrest tightened the circle. Each interview produced new evidence. Each conviction brought investigators closer to the people they believed had organized the murder. But one name continued to dominate every conversation: Charlie Adelson. For years, he denied any involvement. He insisted investigators had built a fantasy around coincidence, yet detectives believed the evidence was pointing in only one direction. The question was no longer whether the conspiracy existed, it was how high it reached. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this documentary, take a second to subscribe. These investigations take dozens of hours of research, and your support helps us continue producing long-form true crime documentaries based on evidence, court records, and verified sources. Nearly a decade had passed since Dan Markel was murdered. Most people believed the case had already revealed every secret it could. They were wrong, because investigators weren't finished. The arrests of the gunmen were only the beginning. The trials that followed would expose recorded phone calls, family conversations, financial records, and testimony that prosecutors argued reached all the way into one of South Florida's most prominent families. Justice takes years. Some investigations end with a single arrest. This one didn't. Every conviction uncovered another layer. Every trial raised another question. And for nearly a decade after Dan Markel was murdered, prosecutors continued climbing the ladder they believed led to the people who had ordered his death. For Dan's family, justice wasn't measured in months. It would be measured in years. The first convictions, the first people to face justice were those prosecutors said carried out the murder itself. Luis Rivera made a decision that changed everything. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and agreed to cooperate with the state. In exchange for his testimony, he described in detail how he and Sigfredo Garcia had traveled from South Florida to Tallahassee, first to surveil Dan Markel and later to kill him. His testimony became one of the prosecution's most important pieces of evidence. Sigfredo Garcia maintained his innocence, but after hearing the evidence, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. For investigators, it was confirmation that the shooting itself had been solved, but they believed the people who planned it still hadn't been held accountable. Catherine Magbanua. Next came Catherine Magbanua. Prosecutors alleged she had acted as the intermediary between Charlie Adelson and the gunman. Her first trial ended without a unanimous verdict. The jury couldn't agree. A mistrial was declared. For many cases, that might have been the end. But prosecutors refused to walk away. They retried the case. This time, the jury convicted Catherine Magbanua of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder. According to the source material, prosecutors argued that she had connected the alleged organizers with the men who carried out the killing and benefited financially after the crime. The conspiracy was becoming clearer, but one name still remained at the center of the investigation: Charlie Adelson. Charlie's day in court for years. Charlie Adelson publicly denied any involvement. He insisted the state had built its case on assumptions and speculation. When he finally stood trial, jurors heard weeks of testimony. They listened to Rivera's account. They examined financial records. They heard secretly recorded conversations gathered during the FBI's undercover operation. And they considered the prosecution's argument that Charlie had arranged the murder because Dan Markel refused to allow Wendy and the children to relocate to South Florida. The defense challenged every part of that theory. They argued there was no direct evidence proving Charlie ordered a murder, that the recorded conversations had been taken out of context, that prosecutors were asking jurors to connect dots that simply weren't there. The jury deliberated, then returned with its decision: guilty. Charlie Adelson was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder. For Dan's parents, it was another major step toward justice. But prosecutors still weren't finished. Before we continue, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching. These documentaries take countless hours of research to ensure they're accurate and balanced. If you enjoy this style of true crime storytelling, consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue bringing complex cases like this to life. The investigation continues. Even after Charlie's conviction, the investigation didn't stop. Attention turned once again to members of the Adelson family. As described in the source material, prosecutors later brought charges against Donna Adelson, alleging that she played a role in the murder conspiracy. She has denied the allegations, and the legal proceedings described in the source were ongoing at the time the material was prepared. The case had now stretched across nearly a decade. Multiple trials, thousands of pages of evidence, hundreds of witnesses, and yet the story was still unfolding. A family's loss. It's easy to remember this case because of its complexity. The wiretaps, the undercover operation, the conspiracy, the courtroom drama. But at its heart, this story has always been about one man, Dan Markel. He wasn't simply a law professor. He was a father, a son, a brother, a mentor, someone who devoted his life to teaching, writing, and raising two boys he loved deeply. His parents, Ruth and Phil Markel, spent years attending hearings, speaking publicly about the case, and advocating for justice. No conviction could bring their son back, but each step forward represented another piece of accountability for the family they lost. The legacy of Dan Markel, more than a decade after his murder. Dan Markel's name is still spoken in courtrooms, classrooms, and legal circles across the United States. Not only because of the extraordinary investigation that followed his death, but because of the life he lived before it. His scholarly work continues to be read. Former students still remember his passion for teaching. Friends remember his humor, his intelligence, and above all, his devotion to his children. That may be the greatest tragedy of all. Two young boys grew up without the father who fought so hard to remain part of their lives. Epilogue: when Dan Markel pulled into his driveway on that July morning, he had no reason to believe it would be the last drive of his life. A routine trip home became the beginning of one of America's most remarkable murder-for-hire investigations. An investigation that crossed counties, cities, and years. One that relied on surveillance cameras, phone records, financial evidence, undercover recordings, and the persistence of investigators who refused to let the case go cold. Whether every legal chapter has now been written, or whether new ones still remain, one fact has never changed. A father lost his life, two boys lost their dad, and an entire community lost a man whose future was taken in a matter of seconds. That is the true cost of this case. If you found this documentary informative and thoughtfully researched, please subscribe for more in-depth true crime investigations based on court records and documented evidence. And before you go, where are you watching from? Leave your country or city in the comments below. I read as many comments as I can, and it's incredible to see this community come together from all over the world. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next case.